Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is from the incredible mind of Jack Morrow, from over on Reddit, No Sleep. And as ever, please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid Crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled High Strangeness. Let's get straight into that. I've told this story in its entirety once in the 15 years since it happened. I've written it a million times in my head, but was too afraid to put it on page. See, I think every time a story is told, a piece of it will die. It'll dig less deep, and maybe mean something less. And so, for selfish reasons, and some reasons that I cannot fully understand, I don't like to tell it. I want to hold on to it. I want to hold on to her memory. I want to hold on to my hope that I'll see her again. But I can't take this story with me where I'm going, and so I'll leave it here. Probably no one will read it. It'll get quietly pushed into the dark corner of some database and dissolve like snow in hot water. But this is what happened. This inexorable void of what comes next, for me, be damned. It won't matter if no one reads it. I know they will, and that they'll see it, and they'll come for me. We were living near a town in West Virginia called Elkins, one of thousands of typical undead mountain hamlets that pockmarked the Appalachia. And a few people still there shuffled forward through time on a rotating zombie reflex in sleepy defiance of the finite amount of time every person is given to live a life. And tucked away in those hills, a person could sit back on a porch and quietly wait out the whole of lifetime, listening to the wind in the woods, collecting stories that would never be told. And that's one of the reasons we had moved there. The quiet, it was so profound it almost took on a personality. It was strange how those mountains worked as neighborhoods, however, and driving up to our house would have you winding past particle-board shanties, ramshackle cabins, and derelict houses slowly succumbing to the laws of thermodynamics, that very specific flavor of Appalachian squalor. But every so often, along the roads you would see private driveways shooting off behind those huts and bungalows, and winding up and up until you get to the really nice houses that you could see from town. We lived up in one of those houses, the three of us, that is, her and I, and our dog. We fell in love with the kind of tranquil droning that happens in the deeper mountain woods, the creak of timber in the breeze, the dotted patter of leaves falling, the papery rustling of the forest floor getting kicked up by small game, and even the atonal cawing of the crows, sudden and shrill as it was, contributed to that quiet. We fell in love with living in the stillness, and we were ready to sit on the porch and listen and wait for as long as we could do it together. Our border collie Wiley had a master craftsman's dedication to causing chaos in that stillness, and though all he managed to do was add timbre to that sedate rhythm the hills and trees and deer and birds kept. Now, Main Street Elkins had a regular sort of sadness to it. Well, there was nothing extraordinary about its past and then current economic suffering, its battles or genocides that will make it stand out in the background noise of our country's everyday brand of bleakness. It was just a main street, bookended by green and rusted steel bridges. And that's what kept us from going into town much, I think. There wasn't much in Elkins proper that compelled us to leave our mountain top, and I regret that sometimes, but mostly I cherish the memories of me and her trouncing through the woods with Wiley, as he ripped up anything and everything he could in the dirt and brush, embarking with his brand of delirious dedication to chaotic disruption in his eternal quest for the better stick than the one he had. And I suppose I am again, by virtue of this, a writer. A technical writer, to be more specific. I used to take jobs from companies that I probably shouldn't mention. Companies that built fast airplanes, amazing new medicines, and sometimes even weapons. Fill in the blanks or don't, at your discretion. Forgive me, I haven't written anything in years. As a tender muscle to flex and prone to spasms that show his digression. I might chop this up later. I might keep it raw, in case I forget something. I know she'd probably have encouraged me to edit this for my own sake. And if I had to bet, I don't think I will edit this though. It isn't for you. It isn't for me, or even her. It's for them. I know that they're reading this. I want them to, and I want them to come, and I want them to take me. I won't scream. Not this time. It was a Thursday in early February of 2008. It had been snowing for about 5 hours, and the sun was loitering behind a sheet of static-coloured clouds. I was a little surprised when the phone rang. Fuck me, I yelped when the shrill electronic chime cut through the silence. Jesus Christ, she said, laughing. Do you think you might be getting a little too used to the silence? No such thing, I quickly whispered while cradling the phone. She rolled her eyes and went back to her book. She had taken to reading on my office sofa while I worked lately. Hello? Nothing. No dial tone, no signal of any kind. I hung up, shrugged, and briefly held her bemused and soft gaze. I remember tasting something metallic as if for a moment I held a fistful of pennies in my cheek. I suppressed a gag and took a sip from the tea she had made earlier. The honey-sweet floral aromatics washed a bizarre taste from my tongue and my thoughts. Do you want any more tea? I'm going to make lunch. No, thanks. I'll meet you up there. I just want to finish this section. I feel like I've been writing the same 3 sentences for hours. I liked having her there while I worked. Wiley had always been the one that kept me from rambling at the walls, but he had gone missing about a month before. And at first we weren't worried when he ran off. He'd gone off more than a few times for a better part of a day or more, for reasons I figured I would never understand. I respected him enough not to fret too much about him. He was smart and more capable than half a dozen years of living out there. But after 3 days, I went to town to check the animal shelter and see if he'd been spotted or, hopefully, even picked up. Of course, he hadn't been. The nearest thing to a neighbour that I could ask was a drunk bait maker named Cal, who lived in his dad's old hunting cabin about 2 miles from where our house was. Or maybe half that as the crow flies. I knew asking him if he'd seen my dog was a waste of time, but I asked anyway. His response was to ask me who I was, which was frustrating, but completely reasonable, given how little we ventured out beyond our own property. And by the end of the first week, I think we both knew that it would be best to just try and not imagine the worst-case scenario, and we let it somewhat drop. But we did keep our pictures up of him. And I began to imagine that he'd gone out in some heroic way, like trying to chase a black bear off from the house. Well, that did help blunt the pain of his loss. Now, with Wiley gone, my love took it upon herself to fill his role as my daytime work companion. I welcomed it with full awareness that this arrangement had an expiration date once the spring thaw made her gardening possible again. Sometimes I thought that she might have felt obligated to sit there in silence while I worked, but she was reassuring as she had always been, and she would say that the clacking of the keyboard relaxed her. Well, it's a sort of comfort, remembering the small things like that, coupled with my growing fear as I write them down. As she lilted away, up the stairs to the kitchen, and with that sly dance in her gait, I was hypnotic, the way a babbling stream might be, and I remember following it the night we met, up the stairs of that house, at a party on Dorwart Street, I think it was. I know it was. As she led me to a balcony to smoke cigarettes and talk, but I would have followed that step of hers right off the roof. That day, after that phone call, I didn't follow her. I wish I had. I could have stopped her. I would have stopped her. Instead, true to my word, I sat and retyped the same 3 sentences of whatever it was I was working on. I couldn't even remember what this project was or how long I had been at it. I was just stuck on the last 3 lines. As soon as I looked away from the screen, I would immediately forget what it was I was writing. That kind of totally checked out forgetfulness was something I usually took as a sign that progress was probably just beyond my next break. I was almost tempted by the browser icon, the sing-song promise of the flat soft drink of social media promising a few small hits of neurotransmitters. I was snapped hard back to reality before I even had a chance to escape from it by a clattering in the kitchen. "Hon?" I called up. She didn't answer me. I figured that she probably dropped something and couldn't hear me over the sound of her own frustration. I shut off my monitor and trudged up the steps towards the kitchen. "Hon?" I asked again, quieter, and I expected to see her on the floor as I climbed up, thinking I would be at her eye level. When across the floor, I saw the metal salad bowl that had been obviously the source of the noise, surrounded by green lettuce bits, radish slices, carrot slivers, and her white and red sneakers, brick still, as she was among the mess. She was staring out of the kitchen window above the sink. That window had a partial view of the backyard, which sloped down into the tree line about 200 yards away. "Hun," I could hear her breathing, slow but laboured and deep. "Hun, what's the matter?" I began to step softly across the kitchen towards where she stood, as softly as I could. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel her panic in the air, like static energy. She was tense like a spring, as if she might leap out the window at any moment. I couldn't see through the window at what she was looking at. At my angle, her head was blocking the view, except for the grey sky and the snow-frosted and bare tops of some of the taller sycamores just beyond the tree line. And I kept silent, watching the back of her head as I slowly stepped towards her. I could see her thick, dark chocolate hair, which was gathered in a loose ponytail, waggling slightly as she trembled. Crunch. Lost in a tense current of the moment, I had forgotten the salad on the floor, when it loudly cracked and popped under my foot for what felt, in that moment, to be hours. As the leaf finally gave way and turned to a green pulp beneath my moccasin, she sprung towards the kitchen door, to her right, like a predator cat bounding towards startled prey. "Wait!" I yelled after her, but she was already halfway to the trees by the time I made it to the door. "What is it?" She didn't answer. She didn't even acknowledge me. She just kept running full tilt towards the woods until she disappeared below the slope down to the woods. I called her name over and over, I'm sure of it, but she never looked back. I made it to the edge of the slope, and what I saw as I ran to the short mound that crested the mountain and bordered our flat backyard made me stop fast on the edge of the icy swale. Just over the treetops below me, I saw a flat, circular cloud hovering completely stationary in total defiance of what a cloud does. It was moving gently up and down over one particular spot no more than a couple of 100 yards away from the edge of the backyard. I only managed a brief glimpse of this bizarre cloud. The sight of it caused me to stop fast in my tracks right at the edge of the yard, and carried by my inertia, I slipped and rolled down the suddenly dramatic gradient towards the woods until I smashed into the trunk of a sycamore about 50 or 60 feet from where I had slipped. My chest bared the brunt of the impact, and I lay there for a few minutes, gulping helplessly at the frozen air like a punch-drunk boxer, feeling wet gobs of snow pepper my tongue and throat. On the snow, it tasted metallic, like pennies or maybe aluminum. I was on the verge of passing out when a low electrical thrum filled the air. It was so loud that the snow visibly vibrated as if it were being sifted in some sort of gigantic colander. It shocked me into struggling to my feet, using the tree I had rolled into to slowly walk my hands up, counterbalancing on it against the increasing gradient of the mountain. And I could feel that low noise in my chest and teeth. I heard that sound in parts of my body that I'm sure I'm not supposed to hear things. The pressure on my inner ear and sinuses was becoming unbearable, and I screamed in pain. I screamed harder than I had ever before or since. So hard that a hernia that strain of that scream caused me became the longest lasting of my physical injuries. But as soon as I stopped, so did the thrum. And it was quiet. It was that eerie snowfall quiet, where it seems as though the sound got sucked right out of the air. I gasped and grunted as I sat down against the hill, my knees against the tree. I could feel a couple of the ribs that had to have been broken. Every one of my ragged, crackling breaths came with a sharp pain at the top of my inhale. I took a few shallow breaths and slid myself out from the crook in the tree and the hill. I let myself slowly slide down to a more level bit that I knew led to a small clearing beyond some thicket and bramble, which I quickly figured was exactly where that cloud had been hovering, where she had probably gone. As I slid down the mountainside, clutching my throbbing chest and trying to bear down through the pain and take a deep enough breath to keep from getting any more lightheaded, I was beginning to become more and more aware that metallic taste in my mouth was now accompanied by an increasingly sharp pain in my teeth, specifically my back right molar. Isn't it odd that any kind of toothache can override the brain? even in the most dire situations. At the time, I figured I had knocked a few of my teeth loose on the way down the hill. Vive et prende. No, live and learn. My growing toothache reluctantly moved to the back of my mind. I couldn't call out to her. My chest and gut hurt too much to draw enough breath to say much of anything. I tried several times as I slid down to call out to her. Each time the crackles from my chest were louder than my attempts to shout her name. I was just going to have to find her. And after what seemed far too long to go a couple of 100 yards down a hill, I made it to the bramble that grew along the outside of the levelled off clearing, and I saw that something had bored straight through the sharp mire, directly into the clearing. It was winter, and the springs were sparse and bare. Even the thorny olive trees with their crooked, barb-covered trunks that looked like huge mantis claws growing from the ground seemed frail in the snow. It's strange, thinking back, how the perfect arc shape cut through the bramble seemed completely reasonable at the time. What's more, it didn't occur to me then that a metallic tinge in the air was now peppered with ash, smoke, and wood. I stood uneasily, I limped through an arch, cut through the thicket, and made my way towards the clearing on the other side. Now about 10 feet through the thicket, I stepped on something soft that nearly caused me to fall over. It was a red and white sneaker. Her red and white sneaker, still tied. I left it there and pressed on. I made it to the clearing, staggering out from the arched tunnel through the thicket. "Hun!" I shouted. "Where are you?" I had to stop to adjust my eyes. It was blindingly bright in the clearing. It was not one cloud above me. There was no snow either, falling or on the ground. And there was no wind. There didn't even seem to be a temperature. It was neither warm nor cold. And this is the first time I had admitted to myself that something unnatural was happening. Her running off could have been her spotting Wiley and wanting to catch up to him, which is what I wanted to think right up until that moment when I stepped into the clearing. The first thing I saw in the clearing was what I thought to be a white-tailed buck. It had the general shape of a white-tailed buck, rack of antlers, and it seemed the right size. And this fraction of a moment where it might have been a normal buck stretched around the clearing and lasted for what felt like hours. And finally, my eyes adjusted to the profound brightness in the clearing, and the thing took a step closer to me. At first, I thought that it was about 50 feet away from where I stood at the entrance to the clearing. It hadn't moved at all. It just stared at me. Not startled, not edgy. It seemed almost curious, I think. My eyes had just been flash-cooked by the light change, so only when it moved did I realize it was actually much less farther afield than I had thought. Probably only 50 feet from me, and that it must have been about 12 or 13 feet tall. It was completely hairless, and its bare skin was a kind of matte grey, same as the sky was that day. I don't know if that's significant. As it slowly approached where I stood, it didn't take its eyes off of me. They were impossibly bright shade of blue, and very large, and oriented wrong for a deer. More front-facing than they ought to have been, which gave the thing an altogether too human-looking face. It stopped coming towards me when it got about 10 feet from me. It stared into my eyes, and its head cocked to the side, as if it was studying me, or maybe judging me would be a better word. Then its head snapped around to the woods beyond the clearing behind it, as if it had been startled. But it did not move from where it stood, towering over me. I hadn't heard anything, but I followed its gaze and leaned over to look at what it was looking at. It's strange, but now that I'm writing this all out, I'm finding myself wondering why the hell I didn't run away. Back out the way I came, up the hill, into the house and called. Someone. I don't have a good answer. I was physically able to move at that point, and I was terrified isn't quite the right word. Like I was anticipating something excitedly that I didn't want to happen at all. The point is that I don't think I wanted to leave and have no good reason why I didn't. It was as if somehow my fight or flight response had been shut off completely. Probably the same way you can catch frogs at night. Shine a flashlight directly into their eyes in the dark, and then they won't try to hop away. I mention the frog catching thing only because of what happened next. When I tried to lean over and look past the enormous stag creature, I leaned too far to try and get a good look beyond it. but it was too big for me to simply lean, so I calmly stepped around beside it. The thing didn't even seem to notice me anymore, as if this unnatural moment was now happening to us both. And it was a light that was moving through the trees, beyond the clearing that me and the creature were looking at. At least that's the only word I have for it. I'll try for a few more. It was as if the light was an object with material substance. It didn't really shine as it were. It just filled the air with a weight, or a kind of density, but it was brighter than anything I'd ever seen, even the sun, and moving towards me and the giant grey stag. And it was fast and large, and as it came closer, I noticed the air getting warmer, and that vibrating thrum was building again. I also noticed that it moved in straight lines, as if whatever this object was could simply pass through the trees themselves. And as it got to the edge of the clearing, on the other side from where the stag and I stood, it became too bright to look at. I put my hand up to try and shield my eyes, but when I did, I could see right through it. My hand was nearly completely transparent, but with a vague reddish hue. It was almost like shining a flashlight through the back of your ear, when you can see all the capillaries through the skin. But this light shone through skin, vein, muscle, and even the bones of my hand and arm. Now the heat that thing was throwing off was building in intensity, and with the brightness and deafening thrum. The air in my chest was vibrating against my shattered ribs so hard that I clutched at my shirt and fell to my knees. My ribs and lungs and all of my insides were now visible to me through my clothes and skin. I wasn't invisible. The light was just so bright that it went right through everything. I may have started trying to scream, but I couldn't hear anything at that point to be able to tell if I was. The light and the thrum and the heat continued to cook me, and it felt like I was being dismantled one atom at a time. I looked up at the stag creature, which had not succumbed in the slightest to the light or the sound or the heat. It was still as opaque as it had been, standing solidly in that luminous carnage. When it was looking down at me, it lowered its head so that it was inches away from me, and it stared into me with its impossibly blue eyes, and I could swear that it seemed almost sympathetic towards me. I felt myself rip apart. It seemed slow, and I remember thinking at one point that whatever was obliterating me could have been more courteous and began my obliteration with whatever part of me feels pain, so that I wouldn't have to endure this cosmically barbarous torture. And finally, after yet another dilated moment of mind-liquefying agony, it was emptiness. My whole being was excised from the light, and nothingness took me. In that negative phantasmagoria is where my consciousness finally dissolved, like piss in a bathtub, and mercifully so also went the excruciating pain of my annihilation. Time seemed to take the long way around the patch of infinity I sank into, because when I came to, lying on the ground in my backyard, it was dark and it had stopped snowing. I staggered slowly to my feet, expecting a great deal more pain, but instead I was greeted with just a general stiffness, no more intense than my aging body might feel after a nap in my office chair. And I thought of her, lying on the sofa. I went into the house and called out for her. "Hun?" I managed to croak out. My throat was somewhat sore. I rubbed at it, and my hand found a tender spot at the back of my jaw. Prodding around with my tongue, I felt that the back right molar was much more unfamiliar feeling than it used to be, and throbbing steadily with a dull ache. I went to the bathroom, calling out again. "Hun, where'd you get to? I think I must have fell in the kitchen." I turned on the bright lights above the mirror and pulled my cheek open to get a good look at my tooth, and I saw that I was missing my silver filling that I had since I was in 7th grade. What the A loud banging at the door startled me so that I bit my own finger. I tasted the metallic tang of my own blood, as if my cheeks were stuffed with a fistful of pennies. "Hun, do you see someone at the door?" I said, my voice beginning to waver. I knew she wasn't there, but pretending that she was, and that nothing had happened, allowed me to suppress the sense of terror and wrongness that was building inside of me. I went to the door and stood on my toes and looked through the frosted glass window out to the porch. I didn't see anyone, and so I lowered myself back onto my flat feet that I then noticed were bare. I had been wearing shoes, hadn't I? Yes, moccasins, I believe. The one she gifted to you." The voice was coming from the kitchen. It was hard to place as either distinctly male or female, and it had a chirping quality to it that sounded almost insectoid, like a cicada or a cricket. Too disoriented for normal fear and too tired for panic, I walked towards the kitchen. I could hear rustling around, and I slowly but deliberately made my way down the hall. My pace afforded me time to listen closely for what might be waiting for me when I got to the kitchen. And I could swear it sounded as if half a dozen small animals had gotten in and were skittering about the place, rooting around for food or who knows what. When I got to the end of the hall and looked into the kitchen, I scanned over the place from right to left. I saw the door that I remember her darting out of, and then the window above the sink where she had stood staring at whatever had caused all of this. And on the floor was the salad she had dropped, which looked wilted and brown, as if it had been laying there for at least a day or two. And still scanning the room, I noticed the refrigerator looked different somehow. Only later would I realize that it was missing some photographs. To the left of me, the door to the basement slammed shut. I heard nothing patter down those wooden steps, which could amplify the sound of one of Wiley's tennis balls bouncing down them, to the point where it sounded like a car rolling off a cliff. And I figured either a draft had slammed the door or some uncanny horror. I was now too shell-shocked to care which. And the front door banged again. This time it was repeated and somehow more human sounding than the first time. And so I turned around and went back to the front door. And without checking through the window, I swung open the door. To call what stood on the other side of the door a man would be somewhat misleading. It stood about 6 inches taller than I, and was wearing a bespoke grey suit and black tie, and it was holding what appeared to be a large tan raincoat and a black umbrella. Its mouth was a bit too wide, oriented upwards in the corners, and its lips were all but non-existent. Its eyes were human-looking enough, though a very bright shade of blue, like a newborn's, and set strangely in its head. Its skin was, for lack of a better word, flawless. It showed no age, no pores, or marks of any kind, not even a single hair. "May I come in?" it asked without the least bit of inflection or expression. I stepped back and held the door open for it. I liked to tell myself I was just being fearless and maybe too tired to be afraid to let them in. That I wanted answers, and I was going to get them from whatever this thing or person was. However, the truth is that, in the moment I felt as though I was on autopilot, like my behavior was being piloted remotely by someone or something that only had a vague idea of how people think and feel and act. When it walked past me, dropped its coat and umbrella on the floor, and went straight down the hall to the kitchen. I followed it after it disappeared to the left towards the refrigerator, and it had opened the fridge and was bent over rooting through it. I stood up straight and turned around to look at me. It held up a bottle of Worcestershire sauce. "May I?" it asked with a puzzled, maybe even playful, detachment. "Help yourself," I replied. It unscrewed the lid and brought it up to its wide mouth, pursed its pencil-thin lips around it, and began to suck on it. Seemingly unsatisfied, it removed the plastic dripper from the bottle and chugged down all of the Worcestershire. "Thank you," it said breathlessly, as though its thirst had been quenched. "I've brought you a few things," it said. "I'm afraid I've left them with my coat. Could you get it?" He went back into the refrigerator while I went to retrieve his coat. I picked it up off the floor and out of the rolled-up coat rolled my moccasins. I picked up the moccasins and his coat and went back to the kitchen. He was holding up a jar of cocktail olives. Then he removed the lid and began to chug from it. "Thank you for returning these," I said. "That implies that I took them." "I'm still glad you brought them." "You are welcome," it said slowly. It looked me up and down for the briefest moment, and I saw an expression on his face. It was hard to tell what it might have been at the time. His face was so unnatural that I found it difficult to even look at it, let alone read with any accuracy. But, as I thought back on it over the last 15 or so years, I think I understand what it felt when it looked at me. Pity, or at least a rough approximation of it. "Did you happen to find another shoe?" It's white and red. It belonged to my... It raised its long hands and cut me off.
I haven't introduced myself. My name is Simon, Umbra.
Okay, I'm... And Simon raised its hand again to silence me.
You are confused. There was no other shoe.
It said slowly and deliberately. Its eyes very quickly glanced around the room. I knew what it was saying and I didn't like it. We were being observed. I wanted back. I seethed. Right now. Simon looked down to the floor. It kneeled and scraped some of the brown and rotten lettuce over the floor. It held a loose handful of the desiccated salad and smelled it, and then ate all of it. After it slurped down all of the nearly liquid, rotten salad mess, it licked at its fingers soundlessly. Then its neck snapped up and it glared up at me. Its eyes flashed with a bright red light and it burned my eyes in a quick moment as our eyes met like crossing a lens glare in a camera. I groaned in pain and rubbed at my eyes. The bright phosphenes dissipated quickly and I saw his face back to whatever passed as normal for him.
You want who back?
It asked. Oh, it's happening again. Damn. I want her back, Simon. I said, trying to make clear that I did not believe anything it said.
You'll have to be more specific.
I stepped out of the way as I marched to the refrigerator. I ran my hands across the door, looking for our pictures. The ones of me and Wiley and her. But they weren't there. They were gone. I ran back towards the basement steps, and Simon didn't try to stop me. I barreled down them and crashed through the door to my office. And there were large black eyes in a dark room, a dozen or so reflecting a light that trickled down from the steps of the kitchen. And those black eyes were set in large heads, on small and gaunt bodies that looked slick and reflective in a way that made their colour hard to tell in the dim light. And one began to move towards me quickly. I stepped back towards the bottom step before it outstretched its hand, and with its 3 long fingers, like prongs on a fork, it grabbed me. Its grip was strong, too strong for how small of a thing it was, and I tasted something metallic, and a sedate feeling overtook me. And I was being pulled towards the dark corner of the room, but the room wasn't in that corner anymore, and that corner of the basement was now somewhere else. The corner of the basement was full of unnatural yellow lights and surfaces that rolled and slivered at bizarre angles as if the space had been grown, rather than built. I saw metallic objects dangling from the brown darkness above me, and rolling liquid pulsing through the walls like the inside of an eyeball. But mostly, what I saw in that space were those black and humongous eyes that held me in a gaze that I will never understand. A loud came from the top of the basement stairs. I turned around and saw Simon standing in the doorframe, and it had turned on a light for the basement steps. And when I turned back around into my adequately lit office, there were no large black eyes staring back at me. It was my basement office again. I went to the desk and frantically ripped apart the drawers, looking for a picture of her. A note, something with a name on it. I found nothing. I slumped into the chair. My arms hung limp off the sides, and I had myself a very sleepy sort of panic attack.
You should work,
came Simon's very monotonous and chirping voice.
It can be a very common endeavour.
I looked up at the wall above my monitor. I could feel his gaze on the back of my skull. I was angry at some level, but for some reason I couldn't access that rage. Couldn't even really remember why I should be angry. You took something. You, whatever the fuck you are and whatever the fuck happened in the woods.
The woods?
Asked Simon.
Whatever happened in the woods? Yes, the woods. May I make a suggestion, Arthur?
Arthur? Was that who I am? Who I was? Is that what they were making me into? To replace what they took and bury what they did? I don't think that I'll find work all that common, I hissed through clenched teeth.
I know some have found your work common. Finish your work, Arthur. Time is finite at this angle, and especially your time. So you don't have forever.
I was still staring at the wall above my monitor. I was trying to hold on to any of it. Everything was slipping away like I had awoken from one nightmare straight into the next nightmare. Flashes of that place at the corner of my room leapt through my mind like snapshots.
It is Arthur, you know,
Simon said. I couldn't tell if Simon was emphasizing its point or whether it was reassuring me that I am Arthur. It seemed alien to me, that name, but it had rung somehow familiar. And I felt Simon come closer to me, like a weight moving through the room that bent my mind towards his. And I saw Simon in a reflection of the old CRT monitor that I used for my work, backlit from the light coming from the basement stairs, and his form was smeared across the black glass like shapes in a puddle in the rain, while everything else in the room reflected with a fidelity of normal reality. And in that reflection on the screen, in that dimly lit end of the room, for the briefest of moments, I am sure I saw Simon as he did not mean to be seen by me. Huge and with glowing red eyes, a gaunt frame that sloped to avoid the 8-foot tall ceiling of the office, all black like a shadow with what I could swear might have been 10 or 12-foot wings growing from its back and folded in on themselves. And I blinked, and that wrong image that was laid bare to me for the shortest second was gone and replaced with the image of a shirt, grey jacket, black tie, and spindly fingers on a long hand, slowly reaching past my neck. And that hand glided past me, and Simon extended his long pointer finger and pushed the power button on the monitor in front of me. It clicked on with its familiar tinnitus-pitched electric whine, and I felt Simon's other hand rest upon the back of the chair as he stood up straight.
One might caution against repetition, Arthur. Some things lose their meaning when repeated. People too seem to lose cohesion when they repeat themselves. If ever there was such a thing as cohesion, meaning gets lost. Some things are meant to be lost and stay lost.
I spun around to face Simon. I looked directly into those impossibly blue eyes, which were a touch too large and too far apart to engender anything close to comfort. And his gaze was darting, like an animal studying something it didn't need or particularly want to understand. He spun me back around in my chair so that my eyes fell on the monitor, my previous Word document still open from before, the caret still blinking at the end of the last sentence I had typed.
Work can be common, Arthur. It can give one purpose,
said Simon in his chirping drone.
But remember what I said. You can never tell who your audience will be, or how closely they will listen.
I glanced back over my shoulder and watched as Simon went back towards the basement stairs. Its entire frame enveloped the light of the kitchen, which seemed to grow with a strange intensity as Simon faded within it. I didn't hear any patter or creak from those snare-tight steps leading up to the kitchen, but I knew that whatever Simon was, or perhaps still is, was gone. I looked back at the monitor, the same 3 lines I had been working on before. I remembered the phone call, the taste of pennies, the thrum, the stag, and the annihilating brightness. But only then did I remember those 3 sentences I had worked on before the light, and the woods, and the otherness. I was about to erase everything from that page right then. I highlighted everything on it, but as I was about to hit the delete key, I heard a familiar scratching and barking at the back door from familiar paws. I went to let Wiley back in, knowing that his experience would never be taken from him, whatever it had been. I was envious of the dog for that. I still am. That experience could only be remembered by him and never told. Or maybe he didn't remember it. Maybe he didn't need to. Now he nuzzled excitedly through the back door into the kitchen and got his food and water dishes from the cabinet and stowed them in when we were unwilling to write Wiley off as dead. He watched me with his head cocked, his brow raised as I set the bowls down. And as soon as the bowls touched the tile, he darted off down the basement and into my office. When I got down the stairs and back into my office, I found him on the sofa, sniffing frantically at the cushions and the throw pillows. Reflexively, I cocked my head and raised my eyebrow, and I sat at the chair once more as Wiley spun and settled into a ball in the middle of the sofa. I read the last 3 lines once more. She never existed. Don't say her name. Don't say her name. The years passed up there on our mountain, and I held on to the story as a precious and secret thing, horrified at what would happen if I spoke it aloud. But I'm older, and the cancer has been quietly spreading around my body in an almost mocking inverse of the violence and sudden annihilation of that unnatural light in the woods. It doesn't matter though, not anymore. I know her name, and Rachel, I'm coming for you. I see their eyes. She's here. I'll follow her. Wow. Certainly another one. Wow. What an intriguing and mystery-filled story there, and what I believe to be the start of an incredible series. Of course, a huge thank you to the incredible author, Zach Jack Morrow, from over on Reddit, No Sleep. Fantastic stuff there, Zach. Really creative and intriguing storyline, and I can't wait to see where you take things next. Well, guys and girls as ever, you know the drill. Please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid Crew. Now if you're an aspiring writer or would just like to have a crack at things like myself, then please do get in touch with me at the contact email, which is as on screen. contactthedeadone@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. I hope you all had a fantastic weekend with good food and drink and even better company. And you're fighting fit and taking a fight back to life. But above all, guys, remember, be safe, not sorry. And as ever, please do let us know what you thought. And as ever, please do let me know what you thought down the. And as ever, please do let me know what you thought. Hashtag. We were living near a town in West Virginia called Elkins, one of thousands of typical undead mountain hamlets that pockmarked the. We lived up in one of those houses. I'm like a fucking hillbilly. Here, boy! That show us digression. Fucking whistling teeth! And we let it somewhat drop, but we did keep our pictures up of him. By the end of the first week, I think we both knew that it would be best to just try and not imagine the worst case scenario. And we let it. On the snow, it tasted metallic, like pennies or maybe aluminum. Aluminum? Aluminium, aluminum. Num num. To the left, to the left. Everything you want, and to the left. Clickety fuck, clickety bang, bang, bang.